I'm Jo Davis. I've been working for Avison Young for 25 years, and I am the UK chairman and also the managing director of Place, which covers off our land and development, our agency, our development consultancy, our regeneration and our planning teams and our rights of light. So it's a great cluster of business opportunities all coming together to really drive the quality of place across the country and across our cities.
Planning is a bit of a mess, isn't it? A number of housing projects granted planning permission in England last year falling to the lowest level since 2006, going to fall even further, probably with all the other issues that we're facing, and now scrapping of housing targets seems to be making life even more difficult. What do you wish the government would do to try and sort this out?
I mean, planning is always the kind of the political football that plays around, and as we move towards an inevitable election next year, we're going to see more uncertainty, more discussion, but not a lot of action in that kind of planning field. Lots of promises, but not a lot of action. That certainly came out of the spring budget as well. So there's kind of two pieces to this conversation, really, isn't there? There is the absolute challenge in terms of the number of planning applications, down 16-year low last year. Now that's a problem today, but that's a problem that will play out over 3 to 5 years, because actually it's that pipeline of planning applications which is so critical to us having continuity of growth across the country. And that's not just about dealing with the housing problem, but that's also about dealing with the foundation of the economy, because if we haven't got houses in the right places at the right price point for people, we can't get those people into those jobs, and therefore the economy and our cities suffer. So it's a huge issue for us. The second piece to that, of course, is, as you've referred to, is about the housing targets. And if I take the Bristol example, only yesterday we had an announcement, we had an appeal allowed on a site for 260 houses, which was a Homes England site that therefore was an allocation. And the inspector concluded there was a housing supply of 2 to 2.4 years on that 5-year housing land supply. Now, why are we seeing those sorts of sites going to an appeal? Because actually that's an allocation that's been well considered, and that's where unfortunately NIMBYism still comes in. Those kind of local challenges and those tensions between what the locals want and need and actually what a city needs are two different things, and it's a critical challenge for us. We need to find a way to address that much more robustly through the planning process. So there's lots of issues. Then of course, if we look at London, we've got a second issue, haven't we, which is about the property industry that's just grappling with the level of uncertainty that we've got. That there's still a lot of uncertainty around build costs. There's uncertainty around offices and the office market and industrial values. That all plays into this piece. And then of course, where's the office going to bounce back? So where do you put houses, and what office material comes into the housing pot? So there's a whole load of uncertainties around that. And then of course you've got the cost of borrowing, and you've got the delivery pieces and the viability of these projects. So there's a lot of challenges as well as planning that we need to deal with if we're going to have a consistency of supply over an extended period of time. And it's that consistency of supply which is really critical, I think. I want to eliminate the word NIMBYism, because I think what it's about understanding. I think the fact that people are so interested in planning is such a positive, and yet from a media place, it's played as quite a negative. I think the fact that we've got people who are genuinely interested in the places that they live and what happens around them is really important, and I think we should capture that enthusiasm, that interest, and help walk them through that process. So design codes have a really important role to play in that. The greatest role they play, I believe, is where we're looking at new settlements or urban extensions or very big areas of new development. And I say that because that allows you to set the quality, to talk about place, to have those discussions with the community and the professionals, which leads to two things. When you get on the ground with the planning permission, it accelerates that process. But also we know, and what we've learned over the last 20 years is that actually quality of place enhances the value. A well-designed open space attracts people, it attracts the cafes, it attracts that value add, and therefore commercially it's an absolutely great thing. The second point I would say is that with the problem with that scenario of creating those design codes is there is a time period for those design codes, but also there's a very big cost. an urban extension is going to put you into a six-figure sum, and can the local authorities, in partnership with the private sector, invest that money up front to get those design codes going, to move them forward. If we look about the London boroughs, you know, the London boroughs know the character of their areas so well, and therefore maybe design codes are slightly different there. It's about bringing together much more quickly the professionals within those boroughs that can make decisions to move those applications forward rather than just relying on the planners. We've got a skills shortage. We're all aware of that as well. So design codes have a really important role. It's how they're used, but most importantly, it's how they're developed. And that has to be a collaborative approach with the private sector to make sure we don't end up with something that can't be delivered.
So you move between offices in London and Bristol. I mean, what do you see as the impact of COVID on the two cities? And has the centre of Bristol recovered, or is it seeing the same sort of problems as we're seeing here in London, well, particularly here where we are in the city?
Without question, the return to the office was much quicker in Bristol than it was in London. Same factors influencing it, you know, in terms of, you know, businesses grappling with what hybrid working looks like, grappling with what that means in terms of their office supply and the size of their office. But certainly we then saw those offices really coming back to the flight for quality, because companies knew that if they were downsizing, the quality of that space needed to be improved in order to attract and retain the best people. And therefore then their commitments to ESG needed to include. So you've seen a number of sites now in Bristol that are being developed that are actually BREEAM exemplar. You know, they're really pushing the parameters of those things, and that's how they're attracting those big occupiers into it. That downsizing also means that you need to be thinking about what we're going to do with our Cat A space at the moment and how that works. So I would say that Bristol was faster and quicker, but it is experiencing some of the same challenges. If I look to London, and you know, I speak to my leasing team, what they're saying is that 2023 so far has seen a strong increase in tenant viewings and inquiries and inquiry activity compared to last year. And therefore those people who are holding out to work out what was going to happen are now actually reinvesting back in the cities. And we will start to see looking at office space, but with the same issues. What's the ESG credentials? What does the space look like? What does really Cat A space look like to get people back into those areas? And the other thing that's really interesting, of course, is that the other thing we do is we look at the key London commuter stations, and they're at 90% back of pre-pandemic levels. So it is changing. I think the timing that people are moving into the cities is changing, and the cities and the spaces and the services that sit around them are taking longer to respond. So, you know, the shops and the cafes and the restaurants. But without question, you know, Thursday is the new Friday. I think we're certainly seeing those big tenants and those big headquarters moving out of the cities, and not just to Bristol. You know, HSBC have just confirmed that their headquarters are going to be in Bristol now, so that's a really important piece for the city, as well as British Telecommunications. But also moving up into London. You know, the work that we're doing in Newcastle is a really good example in Pilgrim Street, where actually government offices going out and repurposing themselves in the cities, and that's making a huge impact. Levelling Up plays into that really well, but we've got to be really clear that there are investments going on in the cities as well. Without question, I can see, you know, the City of London, where we are at the moment, really changing the way that it operates going forward. But there's always a time lag for these things, where actually developers then start to think about how they want to respond to market changes. And I think that's what we're seeing. But I think that interest in leasing and occupiers looking in the cities should be a really real positive, and we should build on that in the coming months.
So do you think the city here has got it right with their destination city approach? Is that?
I think those sorts of initiatives are really helpful. I think that what we've got to do is we've got to really work on the ability for our cities and places to be nimble, to be able to respond, but actually, you know, that kind of placemaking, that engagement and that brand is really important.
But of course, one of the things that the Mayor of London has said, that he supports the idea of the 15-minute city, and the original Carlos Moreno 15-minute city tried to reduce commuting, and commuting is essential for the livelihood of the centre of the city, isn't it? I mean, how do you feel about 15-minute cities as a theory?
So as a theory, I absolutely understand the theory. The idea that actually you put things close together and that you have mixed uses at every level, and the granulation of your cities and your city areas to service all things, I think is absolutely the right thing, and walking and cycling is actively encouraged. But of course, you know, in London we've got international businesses, we've got business visitors, we've got tourists, you know, we've got people commuting. So I don't think they have to be mutually exclusive. I think what we have to do is we have to ensure that we put really strong placemaking into everything we do. So when we're looking at regeneration, let's not just look at connectivity of the immediate piece of urban fabric that we're redeveloping. Let's look about how that connectivity ripples into the wider area. Where's the hook into the next community to allow them to come through and use these spaces? And it comes back to good placemaking. Good placemaking means that we have higher commercial values, which is good for our investors, it's good for the people who live there, and it's good for the occupiers that sit within there. So they're not mutually exclusive. The 15-minute city is a good example of a theory that every city should develop and consider to make sure that it's responsive to what's happening in their city and their place.
And finally, this month NLA is going to launch its next annual report on tall buildings in London, and over the last 10 years we've seen a actual sort of increase in the pipeline. But do you think it's possible for particularly outer London to deliver the homes it needs through gentle density, or are tall buildings still essential, do you think?
So I think there's a piece that you haven't mentioned there before we talk about tall buildings, which is if we're going to deliver the housing targets we've got, a incoming political party in the next election needs to have an honest look at Greenbelt and Greenbelt quality, because we're not going to deliver the level of houses we need without that taking place, not just in London but across the country. And we do need to, as I said earlier on, we need to be putting the houses where the jobs are, and they need to be affordable, because that is that's how we deliver a resilient economy. If we've got the right workforce that's able to commute into the places and be able to afford to live there, to do those jobs, that's how you get a resilient economy, and that is critical to this piece. So that's an extra piece in this. Then when we talk about tall buildings, we really need to be thinking about where are those right locations. So there's a really important piece of work to be done there. We also need to be thinking about the fire regs and really thinking very carefully about actually what spaces we're creating and how they operate. And one of the community engagements that I did a number of years ago, I was blown over by a community group that lived in a 22-storey building, a 1960s 22-storey building, and they met in the laundry in the basement, and that's where we did the community engagement, because that's where they all went. Every week they went down there and they did their laundry. That's where they learned about what things were going on. And they just put this really simply to me. It's like living in a terrace street, but vertically. And what we've got to do is create those spaces within those buildings that are usable and relevant. And in a terrace street, where do you see your neighbours? Where do you check on your neighbours? When you're doing your recycling, it's exactly the same in these places. We need to think more intelligently and innovatively about actually how we create those communities within those taller buildings. You know, and a lot of the build-to-rent pieces that are going on are really capturing this and making a huge success of this. So I think that there is room for tall buildings in our cities, and I think there is room for tall buildings on our peripheries, and we've just got to be very careful in terms of the way we plan it, very thoughtful in the spaces we create around it, and be very engaged. But it also takes really strong leadership to get it right, and I think that those are all the ingredients that we're going to need if we're going to meet, address, or even respond to the ongoing housing crisis we've got.
So thank you very much indeed.
Pleasure.